ingredients or mixing it like with flour, for instance.
I was joined earlier by Gerard Henderson, head of the Sydney Institute, columnist for The Australian and author of the Media Watchdog blog. Gerard, you had one against the Greens marijuana plan, you had many for it. What does that survey of an ABC audience tell you?
Well, I think Fran Kelly tried to present both sides of the argument, but in relation to the audience reaction, look, with the ABC, with ABC Breakfast on Radio National, with News Breakfast on ABC TV, when you ask for people to call in or send their tweets, it's a bit like the entire editorial board of the Green Left Weekly all sort of jams in, and what you just get is left-wing opinion after left-wing opinion, and that's part of the ABC audience that responds to questions predominantly. There are others, presumably, but I think that's indicative of the response you get from ABC viewers and listeners if you ask them to comment. And so across a whole range of issues, whether it's on climate, whether it's on marijuana, whether it's on the Middle East, I mean, you get that kind of response. It's the kind of the Bible of the Green Left Weekly as spoken early in the morning by ABC viewers and listeners.
Well, the ABC's really got to be more careful about the audience it's cultivating. Should take a lesson that maybe it should look at the other side of the street as well. But moving on to something more serious, Gerard, at least 37 Sydney University academics have signed a pledge to boycott Israeli universities after Israeli soldiers shot riding Palestinian protesters on the border with Gaza after demonstrations organised by the Hamas terrorist group, which does run Gaza. Now, Gerard, I wonder if these academics have any idea of what Israel faces from Gaza. Because I look at a Hamas-linked monthly newspaper in Gaza that's recently published a column by an author claiming that the Holocaust, in which some 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis, is just a hoax. He writes that all the scientific university studies have proven resolutely that the Holocaust, in the dimensions that the Jews claim, did not take place and could not have taken place. Even if tens of thousands of Jews were murdered or burned, he says, it is nothing out of the ordinary, and not compared to the suffering of the Muslims, he goes on. Gerard, should these academics at Sydney University read Hamas newspapers more carefully before they pick sides in this conflict?
Well, I don't think they're particularly well informed about Hamas or what goes on in Gaza, and I don't think many of them would appreciate just how close Gaza is to Tel Aviv and even Jerusalem. That the real threat that demonstrators pulling down the terrorists and demonstrators pulling down the walls or getting through the walls would mean within Israel. But they don't really care, because in the battle between the militant Islamist and Israel, they're on the side of the militant Islamist, and that's where they stand, and they don't really care about the history, what happened in the past. What they're looking at is what's happening now, and they're not on the side of Israel. Then they're supporting authoritarian, totalitarian regimes, and they're opposing the only democratic regime in the Middle East, but they're academics, and this tradition is not uncommon within universities. I think there's a degree of huge self-importance here. I mean, having travelled to Israel occasionally, I don't believe that the Israeli government or Israeli universities are terribly concerned about what 37 academics in social sciences, the University of Sydney, really think. I don't think they're particularly fussed about it. I mean, the idea that somehow Israel can be damaged if there's no discussion within these universities in Israel of the influence of the iambic pentameter on English literature in Sydney town in the 18th century, I don't really think. I'm not so sure that the Israelis care much, but the academics at Sydney University, like Nick Rimmer and others, they believe they're so important that the Israelis are going to say, oh gosh, we've got to change our policy. 37 professors in English literature at Sydney University don't like us. I mean, it's pretty unrealistic. But it's pretty symbolic of what's going on.
Standards are still maintained, Gerard. It might be false hope that maybe the iambic pentameter is still a known object at Sydney Uni. Well, I live in hope. But listen, speaking of the intelligentsia cozying up to well, same here. But about the intelligentsia cozying up to dictators, it's nothing new, I guess, in one sense. George Orwell wrote brilliantly about it 60, 70 years ago. what do you make of former Foreign Minister Bob Carr going on Chinese television last week to tell a Chinese audience, including, I presume, democracy campaigners, persecuted Catholics, that their dictator, President Xi Jinping, was a wonderful leader? Here is Bob Carr.
I was impressed by his leadership for the world. America has given up leadership. It's got a very erratic president. But China was saying, we stand for open economies, for more trade. But in the meantime, the Chinese people see their leader as more responsible than the American president. They see China cast in the role as global leader and America looking irresponsible.
I did mention the great George Orwell talking about the intelligentsia licking the boots of strongmen and dictators. Gerard, what did you make of that?
Well, what I made of that is Bob Carr's now a professor, so we're talking about Professor Carr, and there's some of the kind of statements that professors make. But I've been a friend of Bob for decades, and I must say on this he's off the planet. I mean, what Bob Carr is forgetting, and he knows the history of China very well. We've discussed the so-called Great Leap Forward, in which 40 million died. We've discussed the Cultural Revolution, in which 100 million were purged. He knows the authoritarian, totalitarian background of the Chinese regime, and he knows that the current regime, whilst not as bad as his predecessors, denies freedom of expression, freedom of political statement. Now, for a professor at a university in Sydney to go on Chinese television and to praise China without mentioning the fact that there is no freedom of expression within China is a pretty reprehensible act. And I'm not quite sure why Professor Carr did it, but I think he knows better, and he certainly should know better. And in any event, I always think it's unwise for anyone to praise an authoritarian regime whilst denigrating a democratic regime. If you're a believer in democracy, as Bob Carr used to say that he was, but he's now saying apparently that some autocratic regimes are better than a democratic government like the United States, which is an extraordinary proposition to make. But the problem is he comes to these comments with the status as a former Australian Prime Minister, so these comments now have some authority that they never would have had if he hadn't been Foreign Minister for a time in the Gillard government.
I know, that's the extraordinary thing about it. I think it's so damaging. It must be so disheartening for a Chinese audience, among whom would be, like I say, democracy activists worrying about how far they dare go, the members of the persecuted Catholic Church, people just wanting free speech, to hear that kind of stuff. They must think, oh, well, I must be on my own here. I just think that is just terrible. Gerard, let's move on to something a little lighter, but I've got a puzzle, Gerard, I can't figure out. Melania Trump. She's a former model. She dresses beautifully, at least I think so. And despite that, in the year and more since she's been the wife of the President of the United States, she's been on the cover of exactly one top fashion magazine, and that one only in Mexico. In contrast, fashion magazines just couldn't run enough cover shots of Michelle Obama, wife of the left-wing President Barack Obama. Now, can you explain this incredible discrepancy?
Well, I'm not really a fashionista, and you might be surprised about that. And I should also say that the Obama family was a great role model for African Americans in the United States. So you have to acknowledge that. But having said that, look, as you know, the American media is essentially around New York, Los Angeles, Washington is essentially a left-wing outfit, a left-liberal outfit, and they don't like the Trumps. So therefore they don't like Mrs. Trump. They're not going to give her a run. As to the Obamas, they adored them, and they will give Mrs. Obama a run all the time on the covers. I mean, it's just where the media comes from. As to whether it's what readership wants, we don't really know, because I mean, the Trumps have a lot of support in the United States, but certain editors of magazines and newspapers don't want to acknowledge that.
Well, maybe they figure that the kind of elitist audience they cater for will not buy a beautiful dress if the beautiful woman wearing it is someone who is married to a Republican. Maybe it's just like that.
Well, that's possible. That's possible. But I'd buy it,
Gerard,
particularly if it's in Mexico. I'd buy it.
well, Gerard Henderson, you've always been a fashion maven, I know that. Thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Andrew.